why is Trump apparently changing his mind about Ukraine and U.S. involvement? Because after all, wasn't one of the reasons why a lot of people voted for Donald Trump was because he was the guy that was going to get us out of all of these international conflicts? Well, interestingly enough, the answer to this question might have a lot more to do with both Iran and domestic politics than it does with Ukraine. Because you did see a breakdown in Trump's support from sectors of his own base over the strikes in Iran. This was, of course, over fears that we were once again getting pulled into another conflict in the Middle East. And according to some in his base, this would at best lead to thousands of U.S. dead, or at worst, end up getting us into World War III. But it turns out that none of that happened, at least not for now. In fact, Trump was able to pull off a fairly surgical strike and appears to achieve his objectives with very limited U.S. military involvement. On top of that, when it came to Iran, many Americans did see them as a threat. I mean, after all, Iran has attacked us several times, sometimes directly, sometimes using proxies. They organized and funded the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, and to this day, they're funding the Houthis who are currently attacking our ships in the region. On top of this, the Middle East is pretty important to the global economy, not to mention the fact that Iran also poses a threat to many of our regional allies, from Saudi Arabia to Israel to the United Arab Emirates and more. So for many Americans, as frustrated as they might have been with the idea of Trump engaging in military strikes, it seemed to make sense on some level when it came to Iran. Now, with all that considered, Trump could be forgiven by his base for engaging in limited military strikes in Iran. But Russia and Ukraine seems just very different. Russia really hasn't posed any strategic threat to the United States for some time now. Sure, they may invest a couple $1 million in bots trying to influence our elections, but they're not exactly orchestrating bombings of U.S. embassies in foreign countries. On the other side of it, Ukraine is not really a strategic ally of the United States. We're not bound to them by treaty, history, or culture. Now, that's not to say that the United States has not been involved in Ukraine. When Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons post-Cold War, part of the agreement was the territorial protection of Ukraine. Not to mention that the U.S. was very obviously involved in helping to overthrow a Ukrainian leader that was pro-Russia in order to replace him with one that was more pro-West. But even when you consider all of that, it's debatable to what degree the United States should be responsible for protecting Ukraine against Russia. And it's certainly debatable with respect to Trump's base on whether or not we should have spent $185 billion protecting Ukraine. Be that as it may, Trump is once again considering reopening aid to Ukraine in order to fight against Russia. And the answer is, why? What exactly changed? Well, if you look at this from Putin's perspective, when Trump got elected, it represented a massive shift in U.S. foreign policy toward the war. Biden had given something of an open-ended agreement to Ukraine that as long as they were willing to fight, the U.S. would help supply weapons and money. And there's no question that U.S. weapons and money has been essential in keeping Ukraine in the fight. So it's not surprising that Putin would wonder if he had an opportunity to be able to expand his position. Because even if Trump does eventually force him to the negotiating table, if Russia can control more territory, that will factor in significantly with respect to negotiations. But Putin's also watching something else take place. The backlash that Trump got from sectors of his own base for a very limited strike in Iran is telling. Putin may have thought that not only was Trump disinclined to get involved in Ukraine in the first place, but the backlash from his own base might suggest to Putin that Trump is not in a position politically to be able to engage, not with any degree of force or real power. This has led to several instances with Putin appearing to say one thing to Trump over the phone and then doing something very differently on the ground. And so essentially, Putin is forcing Trump's hand. Trump either has to get involved, threatening support from his base once again, or he can ignore it altogether, which essentially gives Putin the green light to continue operations, with only the EU being able to stand in his way. And quite frankly, they're not in the best position to be able to do so, even though their economies and relative military strength should be able to put them in a position to intervene without the United States' assistance. And this is where Trump currently finds himself. But I think Putin might have underestimated something. Yes, Trump did receive some backlash from certain sectors of his base, but the rest of his base and most of the American people actually ended up supporting what he did because he was able to achieve an objective with a limited military strike without greater commitment of U.S. forces. If Trump decided to do something similar in Ukraine, Putin might have found that he's greatly overplayed his hand. Because let's face it, The only reason the war in Ukraine has halted to this World War I style trench warfare is because neither side has air superiority. If Trump were willing to reopen aid or escalate to include using U.S. air power, Putin could find himself in a very dangerous position very quickly. The question is, will Trump's base allow him to do it? And that remains to be seen. But regardless of what Trump chooses to do, in order for him to be able to establish his position for future negotiations, not just with Russia, but any other country that he might have to apply pressure to, he cannot allow Putin's provocation to go unchecked. To the degree he chooses to do so, whether it be through military aid, economic sanctions, or some other measure, Putin has to be brought to heel, and Trump knows it. And while Trump's base might not be willing to accept a large U.S. military commitment to Ukraine, they may be willing to give him enough wiggle room to do what's necessary in order to resolve this quickly and with minimal U.S. intervention. So the ball might be getting put in Putin's court again very quickly. Now, Putin is smart enough to understand that he cannot stand up to U.S. military power. The question is, what degree of brinkmanship is he willing to play against a guy that's been pretty good at negotiating when it comes to foreign policy?